On April 30th, 1945, with the final fall of the last pocket of holdouts, Soviet troops move into the bunker, and they confirm not just the fall of the Third Reich, but the death of Adolf Hitler himself.
According to news reports, Adolf Hitler commits suicide as Soviet forces close in on his underground bunker in Berlin.
History books have long told the story of Adolf Hitler's death, but could there be more to the narrative than we've been led to believe? In a shocking revelation, Mel Gibson and Elon Musk are shedding light on the untold truth about Hitler's final days, details that have been buried for decades. What really happened in Hitler's final moments? And why has the full story been hidden for so long?
April 30th, 1945. Today, Adolf Hitler dies.
The rise and mounting pressures. By the early 1940s, Adolf Hitler had led Nazi Germany to seize large parts of continental Europe. Armed with a formidable military, Germany took control of countries at a rapid pace, often surprising and overpowering neighboring forces. Hitler's strategic moves and propaganda created a strong impression that Nazi control would continue expanding. However, after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, problems began to grow. Harsh winters, long supply lines, and the steadfast Soviet defense slowed the German advance, shifting the momentum of the conflict. At the same time, the Allied powers, which included Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union itself, intensified their combined efforts against Hitler's regime. These expanded efforts put continuous pressure on German troops across multiple fronts. As German battle lines stretched thin, resistance movements grew within occupied territories. Bombing campaigns also targeted German cities.
RAF heavy bombers assist Marshal Connieff's drive into the Reich. The target is Dresden. It was being used to pump German troops into counterattacks against the Russian army not many miles to the east,
weakening both civilian morale and the industrial capacity of the Third Reich. Factories, railways, and communication lines faced heavy damage, making it tougher to keep the war machine going at full strength. Food shortages and rationing became common, and the nation's resources were strained to their limits. Government leaders tried to maintain confidence through official statements and propaganda, but statistical realities were difficult to hide. Forces demanded reinforcements that were no longer easy to provide, and key military operations began to fail. Meanwhile, the military leadership became increasingly concerned that Hitler's decisions did not match battlefield realities. Some officers believed he was ignoring reports or relying on impractical strategies. Attempts to persuade him to adopt different plans often went nowhere. German advances in the Soviet Union stalled, leading to significant losses. On the Western Front, Allied forces landed in France in the summer of 1944, opening a new path toward Germany. As months passed, more Allied ground was gained, and the Nazi hold on Europe slowly loosened. German armies were eventually pushed back within their own borders. These compounding events set the stage for the final year of the war.
Germany signed it on the 11th of November 1918 in General Foch's railway carriage, with the armistice officially coming into effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It would be the end of fighting.
Constant bombing raids over key German cities shredded infrastructure. Transportation networks were disrupted, restricting the movement of troops and supplies. Hitler nonetheless continued to insist on total resistance. Diplomatic contacts with the Allies did not yield any meaningful agreement, as the Allies demanded total surrender. In response, Hitler called on the German population to fight until the end. He accused many of his own commanders of lacking determination if they suggested any possibility of retreat or negotiation. By early 1945, it appeared clear to outside observers that Nazi Germany was heading toward a decisive defeat, though Hitler refused to admit this publicly. The growing isolation of authority. As the Allies moved deeper into Germany, Nazi power structures started to fracture. While Hitler was still officially in command, he relied increasingly on a shrinking group of associates for information. many top lieutenants tried to protect themselves by shifting blame or hiding various failures. The lack of reliable communication made it hard for the central government to coordinate defensive measures. Appealing to patriotic duty, the remaining Nazi leadership urged all Germans to participate in a final stand, but ordinary soldiers and civilians saw the mounting evidence that the war was nearly lost. Military units trapped on various fronts struggled to fend off Allied offensives. Some experienced significant losses, while others were cut off from reinforcements. Rumors of internal dissent spread behind the scenes as cracks formed within Hitler's own hierarchy. Attempts by leading figures such as Hermann Göring or Heinrich Himmler to negotiate a more favorable surrender exposed the lack of unity among Nazi officials. Hitler dismissed these efforts as betrayals, removing or demoting individuals whenever he found evidence of separate negotiations. With Allied forces pressing in, daily life in several major German cities became grim. Civilians who had once cheered the early victories were now more concerned with basic necessities. Businesses functioned sporadically, and power supplies often failed. The flow of basic commodities, including coal and food, was interrupted by the ongoing Allied bombing campaigns. Despite official statements promising ultimate victory, the fatigue among both military troops and the civilian population was impossible to hide. By April 1945, the Soviet Red Army advanced ever closer to the heart of Berlin. Other Allied armies moved in from the west. Their progress highlighted the weakening defensive capabilities of the German forces, as ground was lost practically every day. Some leaders still believed in a last-minute shift of events, perhaps hoping the Allies would disagree with each other. But these hopes did not influence the battlefield reality. The Soviets especially had made capturing Berlin a key objective, and Nazi Germany simply did not have the resources needed to hold back such a massive force. The final battlefield, Berlin.
Berlin unfolds beneath the camera of a reconnaissance aircraft as the Reich capital falls to the Russians. Not enough buildings were left to house Russian generals and their staffs.
In late April, Berlin became the focal point of intense fighting. Soviet artillery bombarded the city, and tank divisions began clearing paths through the outskirts. German resistance inside Berlin included aging veterans, members of the Hitler Youth, and understaffed army units that were hastily organized for urban combat. Barricades appeared on important roads, and makeshift defenses were set up around key government buildings. Despite efforts to organize a proper defense, the Soviets held the advantage in artillery, armor, and manpower. The city itself was deeply scarred by bombing raids. Large sections of residential areas had been reduced to rubble, and many government offices were either destroyed or evacuated. Public services were nearly non-functional. Transportation systems did not operate reliably, and people found it hard to move around safely. Many Berlin residents sought shelter in basements or air raid bunkers, hoping to survive the daily bombardments. Access to fresh food or water was uncertain at best, which added to the desperation of civilians. As the Soviets pushed forward, they took strategic points like airfields, bridges, and rail yards, forcing the Reich's remaining defenders into smaller pockets. The Red Army also seized control of important city landmarks. Reports indicated that resistance inside Berlin, although spirited in certain areas, had no real chance of halting the Soviet advance. A large portion of these defenders had little proper training for street-by-street combat. Morale was heavily impacted by the number of wounded and the hopeless nature of the mission. Soviet units planned their moves to encircle what was left of Hitler's government. Beginning from the outskirts, they methodically closed in, cutting roads and capturing significant crossways. The action around the Reichstag, the German parliament building, was especially fierce, as the Soviets saw symbolic value in raising their flag over it. The further they proceeded, the tighter the noose grew around the central Berlin area, where Hitler and his inner circle were known to have taken shelter. In many ways, this was the culmination of the Eastern Front, a massive clash that had begun years earlier with Germany's attack on the Soviet Union. The Reich Chancellery, and the Führer bunker. As Soviet shells hammered Berlin, Adolf Hitler stayed in a fortified underground complex known as the Führer bunker. This bunker was located beneath the Reich Chancellery building, which was itself heavily damaged by bombing. The bunker had several rooms and thick concrete walls intended to protect its occupants from aerial or artillery attacks. Even so, the noise of bombardment filtered through the structure's halls. Inside, Hitler met with a small group of military and political advisors to plan final measures. Communication with the outer world became increasingly difficult. Radio frequency disruptions and the collapse of telephone lines meant that Hitler could not reliably give orders to forces outside the city. Messages reached him sporadically, often describing further Soviet gains or the surrender of German troops in other areas. He responded with calls for holding ground, but these instructions often arrived too late or were not practical given the circumstances. There were also attempts by officials to approach Allied governments separately, but these were carried out without Hitler's approval. Some hoped these actions might lead to a partial agreement that could spare certain regions from Soviet occupation. As soon as Hitler learned about any such secret moves, he saw them as acts of disloyalty, which led to dismissals or threats of punishment. By this stage, the Nazi chain of command was in disarray, as top-level figures competed to retain influence or secure personal safety. In the bunker, staff members typed out messages, maintained radios where they still worked, and tried to keep some semblance of a schedule. The constant sound of artillery outside made it clear that Soviet troops were drawing closer by the hour. Berlin residents who had stayed behind had no illusions about the city's fate, and there were growing rumors of Hitler's possible suicide.
According to news reports, Adolf Hitler commits suicide as Soviet forces close in on his underground bunker in Berlin.
These rumors arose from the fact that numerous roads had been cut off and that an escape seemed unlikely. Yet official statements continued to encourage everyone to fight on, even when there was little sense in further resistance. Final acts of government. On April 29, 1945, Hitler completed what he considered essential state business within the bunker. He issued a final political testament, blaming various generals and officials for failing to carry out German war objectives. He also repeated accusations about enemies, both inside and outside the country. The document served as a final explanation of why, in his view, the war had not ended in the success he had once promised. Hitler also drafted instructions naming new officials to replace figures he considered traitors. These instructions had little real impact since the city was on the verge of capture. During this same period, Hitler formalized his long-standing relationship with Eva Braun by marrying her in a brief ceremony inside the bunker. This wedding was conducted by a local official, and witnesses signed the necessary paperwork. The reasons behind this ceremonial act have been debated by historians, but it is largely viewed as a personal gesture. Official Nazi news channels in the city did not widely publicize it, given the chaotic conditions and the reality that Berlin was in its last days of defense. That evening, Hitler received updates that Soviet troops continued their advance toward the government district. Reports also indicated that the Soviets had reached several central locations with only minimal resistance remaining. The situation had become dire for any last-ditch military moves. Several top-level Nazis nearby discussed possibly trying to escape through underground routes or even attempting to reach Allied forces outside the city. But for Hitler, captivity was never an option he would consider under any circumstances. Despite the hopelessness of the situation, no official surrender came from the bunker. Instead, Hitler repeated that Germany must keep fighting, even though these instructions had almost no effect on battlefield outcomes. Civilians in Berlin largely realized that the city would inevitably fall to the Soviets, and many government officials had left the capital earlier if they had resources to do so. The day of the suicide. On April 30th, 1945, Soviet artillery intensified its assault on central Berlin, while infantry and tanks pushed to secure the Reichstag and its surroundings. The Reich Chancellery complex was almost completely cut off. Within the bunker, Hitler expressed his intention to die rather than face capture. Reports from various sources describe that he took steps to arrange how his remains would be handled after his death, insisting that his body should be destroyed so it would not be preserved or displayed by hostile forces. At some point around midday, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew to a private space inside the bunker. Accounts from individuals present outside the room indicate that Hitler used a firearm on himself, while Eva Braun likely swallowed poison. The exact sequence of events has been documented differently, but there is a general agreement that both died in the bunker that afternoon. An aide or guards later discovered the bodies, following Hitler's previously stated instructions to cremate them in the Chancellery garden. Rubble and shell damage made the area hazardous, yet the bodies were placed in a shallow pit covered in fuel and set alight. This act brought a dramatic end to Hitler's leadership over the Reich. The top officials he had appointed had no direct means to reverse the tactical situation in Berlin, where Soviet forces were already installing themselves in key sectors. Outside the bunker, shooting and shelling persisted, and some of the last defenders attempted to hold street corners or government buildings. On the Allied side, the news that Hitler was likely dead reached commanders through intercepted messages and word-of-mouth reports. Some hesitated to believe these accounts at first, considering the possibility of a ruse or escape. Although German radio broadcasts did not immediately confirm Hitler's death, the fact that his daily commands ceased and that the bunker staff was in disarray left little room for doubt. For most people in Berlin, hearing that Hitler had died came as rumors in a city that was still under attack. The immediate aftermath in Berlin. Shortly after Hitler's death, efforts to mount any organized defense of the capital rapidly fell apart. By May 2nd, the remaining German forces in Berlin surrendered to the Soviet forces. The city was left in ruins, with many of its major structures gutted by fire or artillery strikes. Soviet troops took control of government buildings and began searching for any high-level Nazi leaders still hiding there. Inside the bunker, some officials and staff made individual decisions on whether to attempt escape or to surrender outright. In the days that followed, Soviet investigators tried locating Hitler's remains. Dental records and personal effects were used to confirm that he had indeed died on April 30th. Various theories would later emerge, suggesting that Hitler escaped to foreign countries or had been secretly flown out of the city. However, ongoing research and official statements from those task forces consistently pointed to the same conclusion, that he had died by suicide in the bunker and that his remains had been partially destroyed. Berlin itself faced a major humanitarian crisis. Thousands of civilians had been displaced from their homes, and the city's infrastructure barely functioned. Soviet authorities imposed martial law, and other occupying powers took control of different regions of Germany. Over time, Allied military governments formed, dividing Germany into zones. The same approach was taken with Berlin, which would become a divided city, setting the stage for future global tensions. But for the moment, the focus was on restoring order, cleaning up debris, and providing shelter for the population. Meanwhile, Joseph Goebbels and his wife died by suicide on May 1st, and Martin Bormann's fate remained uncertain for some time. He likely died trying to escape. The Nazi leadership collapsed entirely, and the war in Europe formally ended on May 8, 1945, when German authorities elsewhere signed an unconditional surrender. This treaty marked the end of the conflict in the European theater, though combat continued in the Pacific until Japan's surrender in September 1945. And now, it seems the weight of the royal family's challenges has taken a toll on his wife, Queen Camilla. In a shocking and emotional moment caught on live TV, the Queen was seen breaking down in tears while the couple were on a tour of Australia and Samoa, leaving audiences worldwide stunned. But what led to this rare public display of vulnerability from a woman known for her composure? Was it the ongoing health struggles of her husband, or something much more personal? Let's get into it. The emotional farewell that made Queen Camilla cry. In February this year, the King of Britain, King Charles, shared with the world that he had been diagnosed with cancer. This announcement was met with concern, but also admiration for his openness. Despite the challenges of undergoing treatment, the king has continued to fulfill his royal duties. One of his most recent commitments was a huge 10-day royal tour of Australia and Samoa, which concluded in late November.
King Charles and Queen Camilla have arrived in Samoa on the second leg of their royal tour, the biggest overseas trip for King Charles since his cancer diagnosis.
The tour ended with an emotional farewell, where the Queen, Camilla, cried during a traditional Ava ceremony in the Samoan village of Sumu. Before we get into why the Queen cried, let's talk about what the Ava ceremony is and what exactly was so emotional about it. The Ava ceremony is a traditional Samoan ritual that holds deep cultural and spiritual importance. It is a formal gathering where a drink called Ava is prepared and shared as a symbol of unity, respect, and goodwill. The ceremony is often used to welcome important guests, mark special occasions, or solidify relationships within the community. Its roots go back centuries, reflecting the rich heritage and traditions of Samoa. For King Charles and Queen Camilla, attending this ceremony during their visit was not only an honor, but also a deeply moving experience. The ceremony took place in the village of Sumu, where the royal couple was warmly received by the locals. The villagers had gone to great lengths to prepare for their arrival, decorating the roadsides and homes to create a festive and welcoming atmosphere. The event was rich in cultural rituals, including traditional songs, dances, and speeches, which added to the emotional weight of the occasion. The Ava itself, made from the roots of the kava plant, was carefully prepared and shared among the participants in a prescribed order. The act of sharing the Ava is seen as a way to establish mutual respect and honor, making it a profound moment for everyone involved. During the ceremony, King Charles was bestowed the honorary title of Tuo, a title that signifies respect and acceptance within Samoan culture. The gesture deeply moved the king, who expressed his heartfelt appreciation to the villagers, saying he will always remain devoted to this part of the world and hope that he survives long enough to come back again and see them. His words touched many hearts, and they showed both his love for the region and the reality of his ongoing health battle. The villagers of Sumu also made it clear how much they appreciated the royal visit. The village chief spoke about the history of royal connections with Samoa, recalling visits by King Charles's late father, Prince Philip, as well as his brothers.
King Charles has been made a High Chief of Samoa during his visit to the Pacific Island. It's the latest stop on the King and Queen's 11-day royal tour.
The chief thanked the king for making time to visit and noted how the royal presence had lifted their house and community. But things don't end there. Queen Camilla also played a huge role during the ceremony, standing by her husband with visible emotion. Some reports suggested that she was crying tears of laughter during a lighter moment of the event, while others noted her tears were a response to the deeply touching atmosphere. Queen Camilla has been a cornerstone of support for King Charles during this challenging time. According to reports, she has encouraged the king to find moments of rest and relaxation amid his busy schedule. The media noted that at Queen Camilla's urging, King Charles has been taking some downtime by reading a great new book, which has provided a welcome distraction from the stresses of his role and health issues. Their relationship has grown even stronger during this period, with courtiers describing them as an amazing team. Queen Camilla has been praised for keeping things real for the king, ensuring he remains grounded and focused despite the pressures he faces. The royal couple's connection to the people of Samoa was evident, and their presence brought joy and pride to the community. The entire event also showed how the king and queen, despite their busy schedules and personal challenges, are still committed to maintaining relationships with nations across the Commonwealth. The tour itself was seen as a major test of King Charles's reign.
This evening I am delighted to mark the renewal of our enduring friendship,
particularly given his health condition. Since his cancer diagnosis in February,
which has announced that the king has been diagnosed with cancer.
The king has been undergoing treatment while maintaining a demanding royal agenda. For this international tour, he traveled with 2 doctors to ensure he could manage his health while fulfilling his commitments. Reports indicate that his treatment is progressing well.
King Charles has been released from the hospital after undergoing a procedure for an enlarged prostate,
allowing him to perform his duties without much interruption. The successful completion of this tour, which included engagements in Australia before reaching Samoa, was a proof of dedication as a monarch. Although some people think Queen Camilla's emotional outburst was linked to her husband's health status, there have been a few suggestions that it could also be due to her poor health status as well. But what exactly is wrong with the Queen's health? Let's get into it. How Queen Camilla's health status contributed to her emotional outburst. Just recently, news came out that Queen Camilla had been battling pneumonia.
Well, Queen Camilla has revealed the chest infection, which caused her to miss several royal duties, was a form of pneumonia,
a respiratory illness that can be particularly dangerous for individuals in her age group. At 77 years old, Camilla has faced immense physical and emotional pressures, which may have contributed to her health challenges. Pneumonia is often associated with symptoms like fatigue, coughing, and difficulty breathing, and it can leave the body feeling weak and vulnerable. For Camilla, the illness seemed to be a result of being overworked and physically exhausted, a condition exacerbated by her demanding royal duties. Throughout the year, Queen Camilla had been juggling a lot of workload, stepping in for both King Charles and Kate Middleton during various royal engagements. Her dedication to the monarchy has been widely recognized, but it has come at a cost. Friends close to the Queen have expressed concern, pointing out that her relentless schedule likely weakened her immune system, leaving her susceptible to illness. One insider mentioned how getting pneumonia at the Queen's age is no small thing. They also talked about how the Queen was run down and vulnerable, and she needs to be cared for as well. Adding to the strain was her support for King Charles, who himself has been battling cancer since early this year. The couple went on a royal tour of Australia and Samoa in October, a trip that proved to be both physically and emotionally taxing. While King Charles traveled with medical support, including 2 doctors, the stress of the journey appeared to have taken a toll on Camilla as well. A source shared that at 77, to be shipped off to the other side of the world to shake hands with thousands of people when your husband has cancer is, quite frankly, too much to ask. The challenges didn't stop there. Camilla's commitment to her role meant that she continued to participate in royal engagements, even as her health deteriorated. In November this year, she attended a state dinner in place of Kate Middleton, who was also recovering from health issues. Although Camilla had taken a step back from some outdoor events to focus on her recovery, her presence at such high-profile occasions showed her determination to fulfill her royal responsibilities despite her condition. This relentless schedule of public appearances and private pressures led many to worry about her well-being. Friends noted that Camilla never aspired to be queen and had not anticipated the demanding nature of the role. The Queen has also received sympathy from the general public. The main sentiment people have been echoing is the fact that many people forget that Camilla never set out to be queen. She just happened to fall in love with a prince. These people believe that the Queen has risen to the demands of the job, but that doesn't make the whole thing any less exhausting. But this isn't the only time the Queen's health has been threatened. Over the years, Camilla has battled illnesses that posed huge threats to her well-being. These health issues, some of which were life-threatening, have shaped her resilience and deepened the admiration many have for her. One of the most notable health scares in Camilla's life occurred in 2010. At the time, she developed a severe sinus infection that caused great discomfort.
Queen is currently unwell with a chest infection, for which her doctors have advised a short period of rest. The statement goes on to say that it's with great regret.
And impacted her ability to carry out her royal duties. Perhaps one of the most alarming moments in Camilla's health history was in 2022 when she contracted COVID-19. The global pandemic had already impacted countless lives, and for someone in her 70s, getting the virus was a huge problem. Camilla's diagnosis was a source of concern for the royal family and the public. Fortunately, she received excellent medical care and made a full recovery. As with her previous illnesses, the pneumonia diagnosis served as a wake-up call for those close to the Queen. Doctors advised her to take time to rest and recover, especially as the colder months approached. Her friends hoped that the Christmas season would provide an opportunity for her to slow down, while being thankful that she seems to have recovered. According to this friend, Camilla just needs to rest and recuperate now over Christmas, and they only hope they drive her and the king to church on Christmas Day if it's cold. Despite these concerns, Camilla has continued to be a pillar of strength for King Charles,